All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Shep Steiner, Associate Professor of Modern Contemporary Art and Theory at the School of Art and editor of the journal Mosaic. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this lecture by Dr. Michael Marder, a lecture that will be followed up this Wednesday with a second lecture by Dr. Gary Sherbert, who's just made it in from Saskatchewan. Dr. Marder's and Dr. Sherbert's lectures are the first set of lectures in a series of 8 events Mosaic will be hosting this term and next. These will all be hosted on traditional territories, and acknowledging this government of the prior, as it's been called, is our responsibility now. So I remind you, the University of Manitoba campuses and research spaces are located on original lands of the Anishinaabe, Ininewek, and Sininewek, Dakota, Oyate, Dene, Inuit, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. recognizes that the treaties signed on these lands are a lifelong, enduring relationship, and we are dedicated to upholding their spirit and intent. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and the present. With this understanding, we commit to supporting Indigenous excellence through active reconciliation, meaningful change, and the creation of an environment where everyone can thrive. Our collaboration with Indigenous communities is grounded in respect and reciprocity, and this guides how we move forward as an institution. I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors. Our lecture tonight is made possible by the Distinguished Visiting Lecture Program here at the university. And it is also funded, like the conference itself, by Mosaic, the Office of the President, the Faculty of Graduate Studies, the School of Art, the Departments of Religion, Sociology, Political Science, and History, and the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities. Mosaic's Managing Editor, Carolyn DeCorno, and Mosaic's Office Manager, Kate Cove, deserve special thanks. And I would like to also acknowledge the work of our 2 interns, Joel Ferguson and Ellis Davidson, as well as Frankie May, who is recording tonight's lecture. And you should know the question period which will follow. I know this will be special. Our speaker is not only a sparkling conversationalist, but has a theory of the spark. Finally, chapeau to the French post-conceptual artist Sedana Fife, who Michael Marder knows. The conference originally emerged out of an idea he had to do a special issue of Mosaic on suicides. I was a little shocked at first by his suggestion. But sitting with the idea and looking back at the history of Mosaic, especially under Don McCance's editorship, I was reminded that this grim existential topic is not only a recurrent trope in literature, art, and theory, but is central to the discourse of ethics. And because so central, hidden and displaced. This displacement and deferral apply to ethics as it is traditionally understood, and also in its expanded sense, vis-a-vis the animal and the environment. So in telescopic form, here we are at the first lecture of Suicides, Ecocides, Untangling Futurity from Out of the Worst. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Michael Marder, is Iker Basque Research Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of the Basque Country. His activities are wide-ranging, to say the least. Plant pedagogy with kids, dialogues with plant scientists, collaborations with musicians and artists are as common in his practice as working within and beyond philosophy in the highest tradition. His books are so wide-ranging and of such number that I will not mention them all. What I will say from the modest perspective of an art historian is that of the ones I have read, all are related, but each is unique. Philosophy for Passengers from 2022, which is accompanied by works by Thomas Saraceno, feels light as air. And if you know Saraceno's sky-born installations, defying gravity comes with a fair modicum of excitement and fear attached. I picked up Pyropolitics, Fire and the Political from 2025, which I would describe as heavy political philosophy, thinking it would be focused on fire in the way a mutual friend, the Basque artist Ibon Aaron Berry, his work Politica Hydraulica focuses on the centralization of water in the Iberian Peninsula under Franco. Was I mistaken? Geopolitics is a thing of the past in pyropolitics. The classical elements of air, earth, and water here give way to fire itself as the principal motive force in the world. A phrase from dump philosophy, a phenomenology of devastation from 2021, has stuck with me for weeks. I keep reciting it like an incantation to understand it. Je suis biomass. I am biomass. We are biomass. It's both a frightful thought in our present context and, with the severest form of irony, a maddeningly comforting one vis-a-vis the leaves that now cover our lawns and streets. Why I still want to fall into them when they are raked into a pile. You come across a lot of aesthetic moments when reading Marder's books. These images stop you dead in your tracks. His colloquial translation of phenomenology as talk show is one I have learned the most from and one of my favorites, and not only because talk shows have been in the news of late. Implicit to the talk show is the tension between looking and reading, which is so important to deconstruction and a robust notion of allegory. But some of you will also know that he has reversed the word in his translation. Logos or talk, which is supplemented by writing, comes first, not second, and from the outside, not the inside. Pro tip from Marder, both to me and you, follow him on this point. Metaleptic reversals of this kind are crucial to critical thinking today. In Plant Thinking, a philosophy of vegetal life from 2013, it is what allows him to register what he calls, quote, the reverberations of vegetal life in beings called human, end quote. Finally, briefly to mention his books published this year alone, some of which are in the U of M bookstore. There is Of Joints and Other Articulations, The Futures of Arthrosophy, Flowers of Fire with the artist Aeneas Tondur, Metamorphoses Reimagined, Eco-Freud from A to Z, What Do Plants Think About, and Pyropolitics, which I mentioned. His lecture tonight is titled Melancholy Variations, Civilization and its Presumed Anti-Ecologism. Please welcome Dr. Michael Marder.
Well, it's great to be here with all of you, and thank you so much for the introduction. I really appreciate your invitation, and it's such a treat to be back in Canada, actually, and to address all of you because, it means a lot personally to me, and I hope that we'll have a stimulating evening. Also in the Q&A, I'm really looking forward to hear what you think about these rather heavy topics of ecocide and kind of apparently collective path toward the collective suicide that we as humanity are on and have been on for a long time. So my talk will be divided into two uneven parts. In the first part, I will be talking about Freud's notion of civilization and how it changes with regard to the ecological crisis that we're living through, and how art actually can address that, how it has been addressing it, and what activism can and cannot do. And in the second part, which will be probably a little bit more substantial on the topic that we're dealing with, we will be talking about the classical Freudian distinction between mourning and melancholia, and maybe some blind spots in the many approaches to this topic, and how that too bears on the environmental crisis. But to begin, I want to point out something that all of you definitely know, that since the third decade of the 21st century, some groups of eco-activists, such as Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, Riposte Alimentaire, or The Last Generation, took in rather large numbers to the actions, mostly in European museums and art galleries, that are meant or have been meant to draw attention to the insufficient measures in the global fight against catastrophic global heating and climate change. And so the rationale behind these démarches is that for public opinion and its average sensibilities, it is much more shocking that an artwork is threatened with destruction, threatened in a very symbolic way. Often nothing actually happens to the artwork in question. So it's more shocking to the average sensibility that an artwork is threatened with destruction than the actual devastation of ecosystems or global climate havoc. And what is interrogated by protest actions taking place in, again, predominantly European art galleries and museums is the topsy-turvy reality where art is worth more than ecology, where cultural products are cherished and preserved, while countless human and other than human lives are condemned to perishing, right? And so protesters, in their turn, accept and intensify the standoff between civilization and nature, right? I think that there is a mirroring going on here, but also a certain standoff between these realms that we know are mutually imbricated, or between the treatment of cultural and natural heritages, shedding light onto the real destruction of life via symbolic destruction of prized artifacts. Now, at the beginning of The Future of an Illusion, Freud argues, and I quote, that art offers substitutive satisfaction for the most deeply felt cultural renunciations, and for that reason it serves as nothing else does to reconcile a man to the sacrifices he has made on behalf of civilization. So art is that small consolation, small prize for all the sacrifices that have been done on behalf of civilization. And curiously enough, then, art is a part of civilization, a very kind of prominent part of it that is meant to cover up and compensate for all the horrors inflicted by civilization itself on psychic character, on the world outside. And Freud adds there also that, I quote again, as a rule, it, that is art, remains inaccessible to the masses who are engaged in exhausting work and have not enjoyed any personal education, right, unquote. So a very apparently elitist kind of comment, but obviously with a grain of truth also given the time when he is writing this, right, in terms of literacy rates and so on. Now, in the curious case of eco-activists, works of art are accessible in many senses of the term, but in their unconscious calculus, renunciation is not compensated for by the substitute satisfaction of art. One could say that here, in addition to the renunciation of instinct and of its immediate satisfaction, there is a realization that civilization demands the repudiation of a livable world. So it's not just some superficial pleasures that we need to give up for the sake of civilization. In the 21st century, and this is what Freud could not see because this was still not the case 100 years ago when he was writing. In the 21st century, there is a realization channeled through these activists and their actions that civilization demands the repudiation not only of our pleasures, but of a livable world. Right? So it is a suicidal civilization, in other words. The destructive force of civilization then boomerangs against the same civilization via the crumbling of its life supports. Now, Freud lists two main goals and means of a civilization. That includes, on the one hand, he says, all the knowledge and capacity that men, the gendered language of the time obviously, men have acquired in order to control the forces of nature and extract its wealth for the satisfaction of human needs. And on the other hand, all the regulations necessary in order to adjust the relations of men to one another, and especially the distribution of available wealth. So extracting it from nature and then regulating interhuman relations and distributing this wealth extracted with this acknowledgement from the other than human world. And this Freudian distinction actually repeats the traditional Jewish interpretation of the Ten Commandments, with the first 5 said to regulate the human relation to God, and the last 5 dictating the norms of human interactions. Except that in Freud, like in Spinoza, God is replaced with nature, right? In Spinoza's ethics, we get Deus sive natura, so God or nature. So we get that very Spinozan moment, not the only one by any means in Freud's work. Now that said, there is nothing ethical about the forces of civilization bearing down upon nature, which is subject to control and extraction. On Freud's reading, then, civilization as such, rather than Western civilization per se, and that's a debatable point, civilization as such is anti-ecological, right? This extractivism is a part of a human relation to civilization, to nature in general, he argues. More than that, if, in his words, every civilization must be built up on coercion and the renunciation of instinct, end quote, then its part adjudicating interhuman relations appears to be a strict corollary to the control and extractivism characteristic of its approach to the other than human world. And so civilization posits itself against external nature as much as against the mix of human, animal, vegetal, and even mineral composition of human existence. So it is a kind of double fight against the world outside of the human, but also the other than human world within the human that makes us who we are. And if this requires the renunciation of instinct, then it, again in Freud's words, detaches man from his primordial animal condition. And I think the interesting point for our purpose today, thinking about death and suicide and ecocide, is that obviously for Freud, especially the Freud after Beyond the Pleasure Principle, there is not only one instinct, not only the pleasure principle or the life instinct, the life force, but the death instinct as well. And if this severe repression that he's talking about is directed against external nature and against internal human nature, then both of these instincts, the life instinct and the death instinct, are stunted, right? Critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, above all Herbert Marcuse, examined in excruciating detail the process and consequences of surplus repression associated with the renunciation of the life instinct. And this is what we are facing especially today. But my point is that the benighted, hyper-civilized human being does not have the luxury of falling back on cultivating the death instinct instead of the life instinct. Both of these ways of psychic development, evolution and involution, are foreclosed to us. And so this conservative vector of the compulsion to repeat, to return to the inorganic condition of any other earlier stages of life's development that Freud calls the death drive, that is foreclosed as well. That is not accessible to us. In Dumb Philosophy, the book that Shep mentioned earlier, I call this the death of death. We have lost even the relation, the possible relationality to death itself. As well. And the ideology of progress, for example, does not pay attention to death. That we know, of course, right? It's not really appearing on the horizon. Perhaps this ideology of progress is unaware of death as much as the unconscious is unaware of it, albeit for another reason altogether. So we get this strange situation where extremes meet, where the unconscious shares a certain oblivion, a certain blindness toward death with the most developed form of industrial and post-industrial civilization. you could say that the highest achievements even of human thinking, Western metaphysics with all of its ideals that are not susceptible to the passage of time, they repeat the same atemporal existence and atemporal kind of mode of being that the unconscious is and has, right? And so at its advanced stage, civilization reaches an impasse, disallowing both living and dying. It is not only the question of how to live well with others, with other humans and other than human existence, but also the question of dying well, and both of these, we need to remember, are being mutilated nowadays. It is not only life, but death itself, and dying in particular. So, let me just... yes, of course, in this sense, we get a kind of possibility that religion holds, according to Freud, of humanizing nature, right? Maybe treating the other than human world with respect, insofar it's like us, like other human beings. In a certain sense, this goes to the heart of ecological thinking. So you could say that ecology and ecological thought is trying to revive ways of living and dying well in this religious sense, but without a protective, threatening father figure that we find, especially in monotheist religions. So this would be a modification that we would include with regard to Freud's theory of religion and the illusions that it holds in store and that it proliferates. And that is probably why the ecological defense is no longer standoffish. It takes the side of the superior force and claims this force for itself as its own, albeit non-appropriable, potentiality. And rather than a capitulation to the threatening forces of nature, it is a stratagem of influencing the other than human nature without mastery, an avowed weakness acclaimed as a higher strength. This is the alternative that we are also presented with. And so too, the humanization of nature among other religious phenomena is for Freud, in his words, derived from the need to put an end to man's perplexity and helplessness in the face of its dreaded forces, to get into a relation with them and finally to influence them, right? To influence not through mastery, but by taking the side of the other than human nature. And of course, I would add to this that very often my own plant thinking has been accused of an undue humanization of the other than human nature. So to say that plants are intelligent has been interpreted as projecting an obviously human notion of intelligence onto plants and saying that they are intelligent like us, but maybe in a slightly different way. And where I reverse really this tendency is by trying to find the vegetal heritage within human beings. So rather than humanizing the other than human nature, what I propose is dehumanizing or vegetalizing the human, including with resort to psychoanalytic resources and means. And if we dig a little bit deeper into Freud and his writings, we'll find that a lot of what is called the unconscious is constituted through other than human forces, be they vegetal, be they animal, or even mineral. So the death drive, what is usually portrayed as the death drive, is really the memory, a kind of almost an impersonal memory, and the trans-species, biological kingdom's memory of the pre-organic condition from which we emerged, right? The death drive is this compulsion to release all tensions and to return to the inorganic condition. It's something that for Freud is really shared among all living beings, whether human or not. And it's a tendency that shapes our psychic life together with a life instinct, or eros, right? Eros and thanatos are these forces and counter forces that shape us. And so this was basically a kind of prelude to the main topic of mourning and melancholia, in order to contemplate our relation to death, whether individual or collective death, to suicide and ecocide, through this cultivation or stunting of the death drive and through these alternative means of mourning and melancholia. Now, reflections on mourning and melancholia become more relevant still in the age of the environmental devastation that we're living or dying through than they were in 1915 when Freud first penned them. Aware of their relevance, psychologist René Lertzmann pays close attention to what she calls the lived experience of environmental degradation, which entails, in her words, environmental melancholia, understood as the arrested and inchoate form of mourning, at the heart of much of the inaction in response to the environmental degradation. So according to Lertzmann, a lot of the inaction that's going on from the individual to the institutional level in the face of the climate crisis has to do with the fact that we have not learned to mourn all the devastation that's happening, and instead are caught up in the cycle of environmental melancholia, which she defines as an arrested, inchoate form of mourning. And Lertzmann is by far not alone in interpreting melancholia in terms of a merely arrested or incomplete mourning and subsequent paralysis. Cosmo Schiania, who is an Italian psychoanalyst, agrees with her verdict, attributing it at least in part to the amorphousness of the object that is lost when it comes to a livable environment. So we're not just mourning a pet or a loved significant other who is a human other, but the entire livable world. And when the object is so amorphous, then it seems that the dynamics of mourning no longer apply. This is what Schiania writes. When we deal with a climate issue, it's difficult to individuate the object of the work of mourning, and thus more difficult than, for example, mourning the loss of a person. Judith Butler similarly defines melancholia in her earlier works, actually, as disavowed mourning, presupposing the conceptual primacy and positivity of mourning, not only as a desirable process to undergo in the case of loss, but also as the absolute point of reference, without which melancholia makes no sense. In turn, melancholia is granted a merely derivative identity, perhaps even a non-identity, as a failure, as an absence, or a rest of mourning, so much so that it's treated as mourning's inchoate form. Now, if we go back to Freud, we see a completely different picture, I would argue. In sharp contrast to these contemporary interpretations, Freud does not treat melancholia as an insubstantial shadow of mourning. Melancholia is neither paralysis nor the suspension nor the disorganization of mourning. It boasts dynamics of its own. And it is virtually impossible to tackle environmental melancholia without an appreciation of these dynamics, which is what I propose a little bit schematically that we do in the remaining time and hopefully in the Q&A that follows as well. Freud begins with an overlap between the two reactions to loss, mourning and melancholia, namely, in his words, the same painful frame of mind, the same loss of interest in the external world, the same loss of capacity to adopt any new love object, which would mean replacing the old object, and the same turning away from any activity that is not connected with thoughts of the lost object, unquote. Mourning and melancholia share the state of inhibition. Right? So the inhibition that was said to be, or paralysis in the words of the psychoanalysts we've heard from or about, is a feature that is actually, according to Freud, common to mourning and melancholia under the title of inhibition. Right? They share the state of inhibition responsible for all of these dispositions, moods, and an overall withdrawal from the world and from activity in it. This means that in environmental crises and concerns, inaction cannot be an exclusive feature of environmental melancholia, since it is a part of the shared character of mourning and melancholia. Nor is it possible to translate the loss of a beloved object in the world into being on the verge of losing the livable world as a whole. More than amorphousness, the amorphousness of the lost object, it is this non-translatability of different kinds of losses into each other's terms, that ought to preoccupy us. And again, going back to the date when Freud wrote his essay Mourning and Melancholia, 1915, It was really the height of World War I, right? In the midst of World War I, when Freud formulates his thoughts on the subject of melancholia, he still does not really explicitly contemplate the real possibility of total world destruction, even though it must have weighed on his mind at the time already as a mere possibility. After all, in the same year, 1915, Freud jots down his famous Thoughts for the Times of War and Death, where he speaks of the great disillusionment triggered by war. In his words, the destruction of an illusion concerning the benefits of advanced civilization, the benefits we were talking about just in the beginning of my remarks, including the mitigation of violence and brutality by upholding high moral standards. In an analogous way, the environmental crisis potentially destroys the illusion of nature's infinite capacity to regenerate, with the proviso that this latter illusion is more deep-seated because older than civilization itself. And this was the point that I made in my 2023 book, The Phoenix Complex, the idea that we see both ourselves and the outside world as these marvelous phoenixes, capable of regenerating and re-emerging from the ashes time and time again, when we factor in the horizons of planetary finitude, where each time the environmental crisis makes this regeneration less and less plausible for a greater number of species on Earth, then we have to wonder at the psychological harm that this sort of hope actually unleashes onto the world, right? And again, something to work through both individually and collectively. Right? Where the trajectories of mourning and melancholia do diverge is with regard to the experience and locus of loss. The melancholic displays something else besides which is lacking in mourning, writes Freud. And namely, it is an extraordinary diminution in his self-regard, an impoverishment of his ego on a grand scale. In mourning, Freud continues, it is the world which has become poor and empty. In melancholia, it is the ego itself. The patient represents his ego to us as worthless, incapable of any achievement, and morally despicable. He reproaches himself, vilifies himself, and expects to be cast out and punished. He abuses himself before everyone and commiserates with his own relatives for being connected with someone so unworthy, unquote. So, of course, an extreme and horrible consequence of such a description of melancholia is suicide, treating oneself as so unworthy as to turn oneself into an object, as Freud will later on say, whose life should be self-terminated in that sense. But, of course, we can easily spot in Freud's description of the uniquely melancholic propensity a misanthropic reaction to the environmental disaster prevalent today. Humanity is a parasite on the body of planet Earth. I'm sure you'll recognize the slightly caricaturized lines that I'm presenting for you now, right? And it would be better for our species to be wiped out. Extinction for humans is better than for then at least everyone else will be saved. The world without us will be an idyllic place of interspecies flourishing. We are worthless and deserve to be extinct, right? All of these lines, they show precisely a melancholic relation to the climate crisis, following Freud's very technical description of it. Right? Freud attributes these and related reactions to the emptying out of an ego in the grip of melancholia. But an ego perceived as separate and from the beginning posited at loggerheads with the world is in its presumed fullness already impoverished and emptied out. So if we already relate to the ego as something set over and against the world, as the subject is in much of Western thought, then it is an ego that is a priori melancholic, a priori emptied out, because a richly developing and living and dying ego is the one that develops in the interface between myself and the world. And in the longer version of my treatment of Freud, I actually show that the psychoanalytic subject at its heart is ecological. So the ego that Freud works with has little or nothing to do with the ego or the subject of classical Western thought. It is much more an ego or a subject that is worn on one's sleeve, that is actually emerging in the intersections and interfaces between myself and the world in that sense, right? So it follows that environmental mourning cannot proceed in a transformative way without accounting for melancholia and taking it on board. So we cannot simply dismiss melancholia. We have to take it on board and follow this double path of mourning and melancholia. If relations to others, including other than human living beings and ecosystems, are constitutive of who I am, then the massive loss of plant and animal species, not to mention of breathable air and fertile topsoils, is an emptying out of the ego as much as of the world. Right? This is what it means, really, if we take Freud's conclusions to their logical kind of culmination given the environmental crisis. It's not just the world loss as a world outside of me. It is my self-loss, my ego loss, in the loss of a livable world as well. Because the two are not separate in that sense. Ecology is not an external object, not an immediate and immense amorphous totality of everything and everyone in existence, but the articulation of the inside and the outside. Right? So ecology is egology in that sense, because the ego is echo. This is my kind of slogan, the short slogan in the Eco-Freud book. The Freudian ego in particular is echo in that sense. Right? Indeed, the polarization of mourning and melancholia beyond the features they have in common may be due to this prior ecological devastation, resulting in a situation where the impoverishment of the ego, or melancholia, and that of the world in mourning are perceived as diametrically opposed. They are not opposed. So the impoverishment of the ego and the impoverishment of the world are one and the same thing if we understand that the ego emerges at the interfaces of myself and the world, right? And so this is a kind of being more Freudian than Freud himself and doing a Freudian corrective to Freud's distinction between mourning and melancholia. The sadomasochism ingrained in the ego-superego dynamic, this bearing down upon oneself, you're worthless, you should be extinct, it's because of you, and so on, may explain the resigned acceptance of, if not the tacit rejoicing in, the punishment meted out in the shape of the environmental crisis and the possibility of human extinction. So this is where this thick texture of our psychological and unconscious relation to the ecological crisis is really important. What seems to be like a self-critical approach can be a severe superego that is beating down upon itself, right, with a huge measure of sadomasochism and actually unconsciously rejoicing in this devastation. The same thing happens with what we call the Anthropocene, right? The horror of having filled the entire world with plastics, every ecosystem, every organism filled with micro and nanoplastics, and the signature of the industrial activity embedded not only in the crusts of the earth, but in our lungs, in the brains, in plant tissues, in everything. Obviously, it brings a kind of measure of horror, but also an unconscious pride of achievement, right? Look, our tiny, compared to the planetary scale and evolutionary scale, our tiny species, Homo sapiens, and maybe a small section of that species has been able to achieve all that, right? This is the sadomasochist reaction, and it's subverse. The crisis, or a crisis of any variety, is seen as the externalized embodiment of a harsh superego. It's the punishment that we deserve, right? That's the punishing consequences of the crisis are received as self-punishment. In commentaries on the disproportionately large responsibility of the Western, white, wealthy, male portion of the humankind for the current state of the world, this sadomasochism is further refined, exacerbated, or rejected, depending on the identity in question and depending on the relation to that identity. So a lot more is going on below the surface, and we need to go deeper and really work through all of these issues. Because assignments of responsibility function at the level of rational calculation and autonomous subjectivity. And we know, thanks to Freud, that we are much more than that. That rational calculations and autonomous subjectivity are a tip of the iceberg that is the subject. So how do we relate to issues of responsibility, including environmental responsibility, based on that everything that happens below the level of conscious subjectivity itself, right? Now, having acknowledged the autochthonous workings of melancholia, Freud affirms that it may disclose something not just about the melancholic, but about the human condition more generally. So there is a certain inner truth to melancholia, and I quote him here: "The melancholic must surely be right in some way and be describing something that is as it seems to be to him. He also seems to us justified in certain other self-accusations. It is merely that he has a keener eye for the truth than other people who are not melancholic. We only wonder why a man has to be ill before he can access a truth of this kind." And this resonates with the conclusions of many contemporary psychologists who say that, and conducting various experiments also, and experimental studies, and other research work, that people who are depressed actually are more accurate about the judgment that other people have about them than people who are not depressed. So there is a certain access to truth that Freud is diagnosing here that is corroborated also by findings of contemporary psychology, not necessarily of the psychoanalytic bent, right? And of course the same needs to be said about the ecological crisis or crisis of any sort. Why do we have to make the world ill and nearly devastated in order to have access to that kind of truth, right? And here I have to mention also something about the flourishing of ecological thinking, ecological thought, and ecology coming to the fore, even as a term coined quite late in the 19th century. It becomes the focus of our thinking and maybe artistic practices precisely when the world is on the verge of collapse, when the life world is on the verge of collapse. So it is not by chance that this happens. It is almost maybe more Hegelian point than Freudian. On the verge of losing something, then we become conscious of it. And unfortunately, maybe this is what is happening with what we call ecology as well, right? So truth value might be the surplus value of melancholia. It's a Freudian observation that withstood the test of time. But another Freudian observation concerning melancholia has a special bearing on the psychology of contemporary world loss. Although a harsh superego is given free rein in denigrating the subject as the culprit behind the catastrophe, unworthy of existence, it proceeds in the absence of an important affective ingredient. So here I quote Freud again: "Feelings of shame in front of other people are lacking in the melancholic, or at least they are not prominent in him. One might emphasize the presence in him of an almost opposite trait of insistent communicativeness, which finds satisfaction in self-exposure." So it's a harsh superego bearing down, but without the feelings of shame that are so crucial to the functioning of the superego as well. While predominantly in the West, the melancholy response to the ecological devastation that we're living through entails the outpouring of self-denigration, it creates value out of the exaggerated attention to one's own valuelessness, to one's worthlessness as an individual or representative of a given group. Self-denigration, in effect, becomes a virtue, to be paraded for all to see in the extreme case of what is now called virtue signaling. Satisfaction in self-exposure, as Freud puts it, is the unconscious positivity within the bleak negativity of melancholia. Now, Freud further hypothesizes that the emptying out of the ego in melancholia, in melancholy self-beratement, is a substitute for violent accusations originally intended for the loved one. Right? So instead of blaming the loved one who passed away, one blames oneself. Right? Faced with the end of the world, in the apocalyptic script of a global ecological collapse or a nuclear world war, the question is, what arouses a melancholy reaction? Is it the loss of the world as such, or is it the loss of myself in it? where myself is not limited to the immediate body and the mind I claim to be my own, but rather encompasses my imagined posthumous futures, be they our carers, the children, or the works I leave behind. Right? So who is it that is being mourned, or who is it that we have a melancholy reaction about? Who or what is it? Is it the world as such, or is it myself in the world, including the traces I leave of myself in it beyond my immediate physical or biological existence? The loved object, which is shifted onto the ego of the melancholic, is likewise ambiguous. It may range from past certainties about survival and regeneration, now proven untenable, to unsustainable lifestyles, or again the world itself, the world as such. Since melancholic subject's identification with that hyper-valorized object was remarkably strong, its loss is taken to be a loss of self. So there's a certain measure of narcissism then, right? If the answer is, I'm actually mourning or having a melancholy reaction about losing myself and traces of myself in the world and not the world as such, then again narcissism comes to the fore the most here, right? And that is where the most remarkable lines of Freud's essay appear at this precise point. As a result, I quote this passage from Freud's text. It's just so eerily beautiful what he writes there. As a result of an identification of the ego with the abandoned object, the shadow of the object fell upon the ego. In this way, an object loss was transformed into an ego loss, and the conflict between the ego and the loved person into a cleavage between the critical activity of the ego and the ego as altered by identification. Right? So it's this image of a shadow of the lost object falling on the ego and the ego not being able to free itself or to come out of that shadow. To my mind, the best cinematic rendition of this dramatic situation is Lars von Trier's 2011 film, precisely titled Melancholia, where a rogue planet, also called Melancholia, is on a collision course with planet Earth. Right? And as the other planet approaches, its shadow literally falls on the landscape, eclipsing the sun and stamping terrestrial existence with encroaching death. Right? It bears repeating that when object loss refers to the immense non-object that is a livable environment or the world as such, the melancholic position of identification with the lost object becomes objectively justifiable. Because who are we? How can we continue existing if all the conditions of possibility for existence are threatened and if they are gone? So this complete identification of and loss of an ego with the lost object is justifiable. Melancholy becomes then the healthiest, paradoxically, this is where I'm leading, melancholy becomes the healthiest reaction to an extreme environmental devastation, as opposed to mourning, which comes to terms, ultimately repairs and patches up and comes to terms with the lost object. Right? So even if that object is more circumscribed than the entire world, melancholy still finds its truth function within the framework of a relational ontology in which the ego does not survive the loss of all or most of its cathexis to others. Right? So it is really questionable whether the ego as such survives the loss of connections to others if that ego is interfacial, if the ego is echo. Right? The creativity of melancholy, its positivity, if we are to believe Freud, lies in the narcissistic inflation of the ego masquerading as its absolute deflation. Right? In our terms, berating humanity as a parasite on the planetary body, the parasite worthy of extermination, is tantamount to a species narcissism, something I mentioned a little bit earlier, secretly taking pride in having achieved planet-scale effects in the age of the Anthropocene. Ecologically inflected misanthropy is, in a speculative reversal reminiscent of Hegel's dialectics, the height of anthropocentrism. Right? The critique of human privilege and of species bias from deep ecology onwards is the undoing of the knots of cathexis, the liberation of libidinal energy still bound to the lost object, who is the human at the evolutionary or theological apex, casting the longest shadow on the ego and motivating interminable narcissistic melancholy. Now, just to conclude at this point, much in Freud's text speaks in favor of the above interpretation of cutting-edge responses to the environmental crisis. And actual death need not be the trigger of melancholia, which may be provoked in Freud's terms, in his words, in situations of being slighted, neglected, or disappointed, unquote. At the vanguard of young people, school-aged climate activists feel slighted, neglected, and disappointed, to repeat Freud's words, by not being given a chance to have a future propitious to a healthy and satisfactory life. So it is understandable that a melancholy reaction would be also arising in the younger generation in this sense. And in extremis, in the extreme situations, these feelings may propel, according to Freud himself, the tendency to suicide, right? So he attributes the tendency to suicide to melancholia and not to mourning, so the tendency to suicide, which would be an individual reflection of or protest against the collective suicide of the human species. And in this connection, what comes to mind is a particular instance that was dismissed as a case of mental illness, but obviously is much more than that. The self-immolation of David Bucknell in New York's Prospect Park in 2019 in protest against the rapid environmental destruction of the planet and the increasing use of fossil fuels for energy production, right? And still, the melancholic condition goes further than that. It bespeaks the unconscious grasp of finitude, of a death from which the ego is not exempt, despite all its everyday illusions. Right? Freud again. The analysis of melancholia now shows that the ego can kill itself only if, owing to the return of the object cathexis, it can treat itself as an object. If it is able to direct against itself the hostility which relates to an object and which represents the ego's original reaction to objects in the external world, end quote. Right? So this is what suicide is for Freud, if the ego actually treats itself as an object which can be terminated in that sense. It is the closest the unconscious itself comes to the experience of time and death, because of course in Freudian psychoanalysis we learn that from the standpoint of the unconscious there is no death. We are all immortal, right? All of that evidence is not registering on the radars of the unconscious. Which also knows no passage of time. This atemporality, immortality are features of unconscious existence. And so the closest that the unconscious may come to the realization of death is through the experience of melancholia and through turning the ego into an object itself. Right? In the Ménage à Trois with Hegel and Freud, we may refer to this as the unconscious self-consciousness, which, devoid of the mechanisms of symbolization, can only find fulfillment in the act of killing oneself. So it's either killing oneself or actually symbolizing, actually speaking about, we have the talking cure in the case of Freud, but speaking about working through and thinking about and acting on this realization, which is more than conscious. Not only does Freud discard the currently popular notion of melancholia as a deficient form of mourning, but he also bestows on melancholia the title of a complex that is a broader template of organization or disorganization of the unconscious, as in the case of the Oedipal complex. The complex of melancholia, he suggests, behaves like an open wound, drawing to itself cathectic energies, psychic energies, from all directions, and emptying the ego until it is totally impoverished, unquote. Other complexes mobilize libidinal energies in patterns of cathexis that are relatively stable and reproducible. Occasionally, an issue or a cause may emerge which is so galvanizing that it draws all mental and political energies to itself. Melancholia undoes such a build-up characteristic of other complexes. It gathers cathexes only to squander them, harnessing eros itself to the work of thanatos. It is therefore a complex of decomplexification or of decathexis. now really coming to my last paragraph, ecological thought and environmental activism participate in the 21st century melancholia complex, we could say, fixated on destruction, devastation, doom, rebellion, even in the case of extinction rebellion, intense opposition, devoid of opposition. And so it is time, I would think, to not to turn to some sort of a positive relation to the environmental crisis or to ecology, but to a positive underside of melancholia itself. These elements that are prevalent today, the elements of negativity, cannot be simply shrugged off. It is necessary to work through them rather than to act them out. And unfortunately, a lot of what's happening now across a whole range of relations to and approaches to the environmental crisis is acting out rather than working through. And our task, I would suggest, is to come up with a post-negative appreciation of ecology, a work still to be undertaken. So I thank you for your attention and look forward to it.
Some questions for Michael Marder.
Hi, Michael Howard. Thanks for your talk. I hope this will make sense. So, as I understand you, you're describing Freud's understanding of civilization as, in some sense, inherently suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
But the interpretive frameworks that you're talking about, including ecological thinking and psychoanalysis, could be said to be part of that civilizational sense of awareness. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the relationship between psychoanalysis, ecological thinking, and civilization, and the type of working through that I hear you in the process of trying to propose.
Oh, yeah, that's a wonderful question. Can you hear me? Or is this working?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay, great. Yes, so you are absolutely right to point out, and these are actually the elements of the history of philosophy, the history of thought that really attract my attention. When something happens against the current, when there's someone swimming against the current, but still within the same cultural milieu, let's say, and I can see that happening quite a bit in the case of Freud's psychoanalysis. Often he's unaware of it himself, and he still follows a certain ideal of the Enlightenment, which of course becomes completely impossible once you take the unconscious into consideration, or no notion of progress actually at the level of morality or psychic life is possible either. And this is one of those cases when psychoanalysis and another relation to these ideas that are enmeshed with the actual practices that produced the ecological crisis are undermining their own history, sometimes subterraneously. I think Freud does that quite a bit. But a part of it has to do not so much with even with texts, but with the actual workings of the unconscious. So that one of my main points in Eco-Freud is that the unconscious is the site where we are both human and more than human. And even if he doesn't explicitly acknowledge this, Freud recovers something of the Aristotelian notion of the psyche, which at its foundations is vegetal, right? For Aristotle, all living beings share in a kind of soul, he calls it, or psyche. We could, use this Greek term that he himself uses. And this is what makes us alive. Us, meaning human beings, animals, plants, all share in this vegetal soul, which is the basis for all psychic life. And I think that what Freud is doing when he is tapping into the unconscious, he's tapping into this vegetal constitution of human beings and of culture itself. And that, to my mind, is one of these exit points. It is one of these possibilities of giving a more positive twist to a notion of ecology and the notion of the resources that are there, resources not in any instrumental sense, but in the sense of the actual resources that make us who we are without us realizing this. And that once these are cultivated, otherwise than stunted or extracted. So everything that Freud says about the predominant approach of civilization to psychic life and to life outside of itself. So once this vegetal and other than human life within us is cultivated differently, the relation to the outside world will also change gradually. So the work of vegetal pedagogies that Shep mentioned in the beginning, the actual practical work with both with children but also with adults in trying to learn together from plants, from our own vegetality and from the plants outside of us, would be, at least to me, is a tiny step in that direction. I don't know if I answer your question. Yeah.
Another question for Dr. Marder?
Good evening. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I just wanted to ask that at a point you did mention that when one is depressed, they have this certain consciousness. I was hoping you could elaborate whether that consciousness is the consciousness of their truth or the consciousness of the state they're in.
Oh, okay, yes. So this was the point I was making about one of those rare instances when Freudian psychoanalysis is actually in complete agreement with experimental or clinical psychology, which is not psychoanalytic today. So when Freud says that melancholy actually puts us in touch with a certain truth, it's he's pointing out that this is not only the truth of our condition, but the truth of other people's relation to us. So we see better without too many illusions that we unconsciously create for ourselves in everyday life, the state of the world and our and of other human beings' relation to us. And this is in complete agreement once again with clinical psychology today that shows that depressed people actually assess the other's views of them, of the depressed person, much more accurately than people who are not depressed. And Freud, of course, laments and says, how much pain do we have to go through in order to be in touch with a certain truth? Which to me sounds like a deep insight, not only in terms of the individual psychological condition, but all kinds of crises, this polycrisis we are all embroiled in, that is so painful and so destructive to everything, and that nonetheless leads us, maybe if we are if we open our eyes wider and our ears, leads us to a certain truth that would not have been accessible were it not for these crises. Right?
We have some more time, and we have, all right.
First of all, I'd like to say, really great talk. And I just kind of want your opinion on, I've been reading The Inhuman by Jean-Francois Lyotard, and in that he talks about kind of less of ecological destruction and more of this cosmic, erasure of everything, the explosion of the sun in 4.5 billion years. I just kind of want to know that, do you think that has any relevance to kind of this conversation about, melancholia and kind of the destruction of the world? Do you think maybe that there's some kind of cosmic melancholia that we can investigate further?
Yeah, that's a great question, of course, and very often the argument that you're pointing to is brought up in the case of a kind of shoulder shrug reaction. Okay, so what? All of these species are going extinct. The planet might become unlivable for a large number of forms of life, but within the cosmic frame, this is not an exception, and maybe things are moving in that direction. Entropy, all of this is actually consistent with the cosmic condition as such. I think that we need to keep in mind the time scales. You yourself mentioned that, of course, we're seeing an accelerating, really mind-bogglingly accelerating devastation of ecosystems, mass extinction, and so on, compared to the cosmic scale of these events. This is really something that is important to beings who are alive, right? To biological existences. This is where we really need to draw a line between biology and physics and say that maybe life emerges as this, yes, doomed from the cosmic perspective, but as a constant protest against the forces of entropy. through this self-renewal, which becomes fetishized and becomes the complex. I called it the Phoenix complex. But nonetheless, there is no life without this protest against entropy, without a certain protest against the basic laws of physics almost, right? And this is something that puzzled philosophers from very early on. So if you think about the medieval period and Avicenna, the great Islamic philosopher of the medieval period, who was puzzled about the fact that plants grew upwards and birds could take flight against the element out of which their bodies were made, right? So plants' bodies are heavy, right? All this bark and trunks and so on. The bird's body is also heavy. It's of the earth for Avicenna. So how come they can actually reach the skies and reach such heights, right? And for Avicenna, this was the main proof of the existence of vegetal and animal souls. The soul, anima, is that which moves within the element against that element. So it's what moves in nature against nature, right? Against nature understood as the nature constructed by physics, by the laws. Okay, we're talking here about medieval physics, which are a bit different, but the laws of physics, everything that happens according to the predominance of a certain element, like the earth, heaviness, all heavy bodies have to return to the earth. How come they move against and outside of it, right? So there's something to be said about this kind of discrepancy between biology and physics, between life and the laws of physics. But also, the other point I want to make in response to this sort of observation is that it very often plays in the hands of a generally nihilistic approach, right? So nihilism usually takes nowadays these cosmic proportions. This shoulder shrug, the so what, everything is doomed to oblivion in any case, is the nihilistic position. So instead of the cosmic scale, we should actually look at the history of nihilism, already diagnosed by Nietzsche and predicted to have a long development from Nietzsche's 19th century, at least 200-300 years, Nietzsche said. Of course, he didn't contemplate the possibility that maybe there will be no livable environment. By the end, nihilism actually exhausts itself as a way of relating to the world and to others. So this is how I would be reading that approach. Yeah, sure.
What a great talk. Thank you. I'm trying to think through something, a question that I have, or maybe a comment more, and that is, speaking of geologic time, but maybe a little bit more modest than the explosion of the sun, inevitable, supernova of the sun. There has been a case in the past, we now know, when the life forms on Earth created made the atmosphere poisonous, and this is, I don't know what it's called, but like the aerobic revolution, the oxygen coming to be the predominant or most significant element of the atmosphere, which killed off most of the living things at that time and ended up with anaerobic bacteria seeking shelter in Arctic and under the water and all the rest of it. So there is a precedent. I wonder how that would fit into your thinking here, and whether I'm not suggesting some kind of collective unconscious memory necessarily, but if we're talking about this vegetative connection, well, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this would fit for sure these two competing forces that are working against one another, but also in parallel, according to Freud himself, in psychic life, not only of human beings, but of all life forms. That is eros and thanatos, the death drive and the life instinct. And so usually, of course, Freud is pointing out that they are kind of counterbalancing one another. But it's a constant complexification of life forms, but then simplification at the same time. So it's an emergence from the inorganic condition and then an attempt to return to that inorganic condition, not as something negative. Death there is not seen as a negative thing, but a certain release of tensions that are constitutive of life itself. And actually, this notion of beyond the pleasure principle is quite interesting, because pleasure itself, as Freud describes it, is, of course, a kind of regulation of those tensions and the release, but it is limited in time, as opposed to the absolute desaturation of tension in the death drive. We find the exact same phenomenon, just relativized or absolutized in a sense. So you could think about this as a certain imbalance within the drives themselves, within the relation of Eros and Thanatos. And I agree that now we are maybe witnessing a similar imbalance, not only on the scale of ecosystems and a planetary scale, but on the scale of thinking itself. Because if we think about it a little bit further, what does it mean, this kind of constant complexification of the life forms and the constant simplification return to the inorganic? The two forces are really analysis and synthesis, right? So there is the analyzing, the breaking up of complex units, and synthesizing, bringing them together. And these are forces that work across matter and the mind, right? This is where we are really overcoming, together with Freud, the Cartesian split between the mind and the body. Analysis and synthesis, Eros and Thanatos are working across all of these levels. And their combinations, their unique combinations, create modes of thinking and modes of being that we're familiar with. Now, there is a certain, I think you would agree with me, that there is a certain emphasis that is being put nowadays on analysis. Thinking needs to be analytical, right? In fact, to think is to analyze. In my field, in philosophy, analytic philosophy enjoys an enormous kind of privilege and status compared to the so-called continental tradition of mostly European philosophy, right? Which is more synthetic and syncretic in that sense. So we are seeing that kind of the privileging of analysis in all spheres, from the material to the psychological, is the inordinate hold of the death drive that kind of tips the scales toward its direction. And so we can, if we look a little bit closer, we can see a certain parallelism between what happens at the level of thinking, more intellectual pursuits, at the level of matter itself, and what happens or doesn't happen to it, whether it decomposes or is kind of preserved in the same chunks that refuse decay and analysis, or at the level of ecosystems and the life world, right? So that would be my approach to this.
We have time for maybe another one or two questions before we retire to the wine and food outside. Anyone? Yes?
Hi, thank you so much for that. I have a question that I hope could bring it a little bit closer to home. And I'm curious to know if you are searching for aesthetic or stylistic choices, or perhaps you're moving forward towards provocations, but at a school of art, for example. What would this theory, how would this theory shape what an art historian is looking for? How could it shape what a student who's making art is thinking during the practice? Is it something that you're noticing already in place? Are these provocations for future moves? I'm curious to know a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Of course, it's not exactly my field, but I have been collaborating with many artists, and I'm familiar with many contexts of art academies and art departments and artistic practices as well. Yes, I would want this to be actually the larger work from which these reflections are drawn in modified form, Eco-Freud from A to Z, is thought of as, I've been thinking about it as a kind of toolkit, so that you can actually to make this usable to activists, to artists, to anyone who is interested in the relation between the unconscious, between psychoanalysis and the ecological crisis. And even the entire book is organized precisely in alphabetical order to make it more usable. So in general, I would want the artists and students themselves to decide how to use these sorts of approaches. But I think that one thing that comes to mind, and I have been thinking about it sort of for a long time in terms of art practices. A lot of art practices that are activist, clearly eco-activist, have a very clear message to send. So you can be, it's a very unambiguous usually message. You probably know the works I'm talking about. And if that is the case, then the question is, who is it that we're speaking to? I don't mean which kind of group or which audience, but who is it that that the artists are addressing through this very clear message in the person who is going to encounter that message? Is it the consciousness that is going to be interpreting and reading this message, or is it the unconscious? And I think that a much more effective way, if that is indeed the point of activist art, to reach really someone through a certain message, is to address the unconscious, right? My very good friend and colleague from Barcelona, Santiago Zabala, has just published a book on philosophy of warnings. It's titled Signs from the Future, Philosophy of Warnings. And he really wonders about this kind of, with all of these crises, there are so many warnings and no one really heeds them. And how do we develop a hermeneutics and a philosophy of warnings that could be effective and that could sort of steer us away from the suicidal path precisely? But the question to me is, and this is something that came up with in public debates I had with Santiago, the question is again, who is it that we are warning? If the unconscious is the actual motivating, driving force of our actions or inactions, and if the unconscious knows no passage of time, as Freud says, and if it's not aware of death and considers itself to be immortal, then no matter how much you warn it about a qualitatively different future, the unconscious would not have that kind of an approach to it. To have a relation to time and to a futurity that is different from the present, we already need to address a certain conscious level of experience, right? So this is maybe, it's obviously an incomplete answer to your question, but within the psychoanalytic framework, as I'm presenting it here, this is the direction which I would be going, right? How to really think about the relation of art to the unconscious in that sense. Yeah.
We have a question here.
Hi, thank you for your talk. That was really exciting. I just have two questions. So, you kind of touched on the first one. I was specifically thinking of land-based artists and just thinking of how, they might engage more, or what your suggestions are in terms of land-based artists engaging more, on this melancholic stance. And the second one is on artificial intelligence, just thinking of the world, and AI sort of taking over to an extent. How do you think artificial intelligence could drive or restrain this melancholic state?
Wow, two very, very complex and difficult questions there. But let's start maybe with land art. Of course, again, going back to Freud, because this is our framework here, one of the schemes for the psyche that Freud has is a topological scheme, right? So he imagines the unconscious and even the conscious psyche as a kind of territory with its landscape, but also with its depth. So in the famous allegory, he talks about the city of Rome with all of these different layers and levels of the civilizations that existed in the same place, depending on how deep you actually go, and then thinking about psychic life a little bit like the city of Rome, but with a strange twist that all of these remnants of past civilizations are preserved intact in the same space. That's where he kind of reaches the limits of the spatial metaphor or allegory there, because you cannot really have that in the same space in a way. But my approach, I think, thinking about land art from this perspective is also thinking about not only the land out there, but the land in us, these landscapes and geological depths within psychic life. And by in us, I don't mean within our heads somehow. It's not this kind of interiorized image of existence that the unconscious is. This is actually, I think, the most prevalent mistake that people make when they think about the psyche or the unconscious, that they think it's something inward. I already talked about the ego as not being inward, but being interfacial. So it's the most outward thing there is. And the unconscious is maybe perhaps even more outward because it is the entire development of the human species, the entire development of different forms of life that culminated in our tiny species, and the development of the planet itself with all of its geological layers and so on that is folded into us. So what is within us is this vast exteriority. And Freud, when he's read carefully, says just that. To give you an example, when he talks about the psychosexual stages of development, he speculates about the stage of latency, the strange stage more or less from the age of 6 to puberty or adolescence when nothing seems to be happening, right? Just very innocent friendships and so on. And Freud says, so it's really abnormal and kind of within the entire chain of the sexualizations of the body, starting with infancy. What must have happened there to have this kind of frozenness? Imagine how each of us in our lifetime commemorates in our psychosexual development the great glacial period, the great ice age that we all relive, the deep history of our planet that we relive in our development all the way to adolescence or puberty, right? So again, this distinction between the inside and the outside is disturbed, it's troubled. And so when we talk about land or the earth, it's important to realize that. And now about AI. I really ask myself whether AI can be an intelligence, whether this is not a misnomer, artificial intelligence, right? Precisely because AI has no density, has no unconscious. It is a kind of set of algorithms. I know all the worries, both in the art field and in the academic field of AI replacing actual human pursuits. But that absence of the unconscious is quite telling, and the experience of time as well, right? Because what is, again here, let me just veer and take a small detour. Freud, again, is in agreement tacitly with Aristotle. When Aristotle asks about the origin of our experience of time, Aristotle says time is not counting what happens on, obviously there are no watches then, but it's not counting the movement of the sun and so on across the sky. We are aware of the passage of time when we notice that something has escaped our attention, when we notice that we have not noticed something. There is a gap, something has changed, right? Something is different from the way it was before, and we have not accompanied this. And this is where the distinction between the past, the present, and the future enters, through this gap, through this interval that escaped our attention. Freud also speculates about the origin of the experience of time, and he says in this wonderful essay on the mystic writing pad that the unconscious has a kind of retractable part, a bit like a snail that comes out of its shell. And sometimes it reaches out these feelers to feel what happens in the outside world, receives the stimulations from that world that it cannot bear for too long, and then retreats into itself, right? So all of us are like these snails that are constantly probing the outside world, but then retreating into ourselves. And the rhythm or the movement of this approach and retreat is what makes up the experience of time, right? So there's always a gap. There's always something in this rhythm, in what Aristotle says, not noticing that I have not noticed something. There is a gap that accounts for time. And in this sense, the AI has no gaps, right? There is no experience of time there at all. There is a memory without forgetting, which is not a memory. And so from the psychoanalytic perspective, it is very difficult to characterize it as an intelligence or as a subjectivity in that sense, right? So this would be the take on it that I could offer spontaneously.
One more question, or are we all too thirsty? Okay, well, please join me in thanking Michael Marder and join us.